Okay, so I want to talk about the kind of the origin story, the beginning. So to me, like when I forget how I came across you, how I came across Nice News, but I was like, what? Like I was like, I don't get it. Like good news isn't a topic. Like when I read news, like whether it's like I live in New York, so I'll pull up like Eater New York, and it's like I want to read news about the food restaurant scene in New York, or Gothamists. Like I want to read locally reported news about New York, and it's like I want to read the topic, and there's going to be good and bad news within that topic. Like good news isn't a topic, but then thinking about it, I'm like, oh, okay, I guess like the appeal of good news is like I'm just thinking of somebody like in a movie or somebody who's like disheveled. They're like having a bad day. They're like, give me some good news, you know? And it's like something like that. So the to me, it implies like the audience for this is like people who are despairing, people who are like consuming too many things and like want this as like a rest stop on the highway of in the desert or what. I'm mixing metaphors here, but I guess that's my question is like, tell me how you came across this idea and like validated this idea that like good news could be an editorial beat in and of itself.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, what you mentioned in terms of like the rest stop, initially the idea for Nice News kind of started to come about early 2021 during the peak of COVID, when I just found myself overwhelmed by the news cycle and like checking the New York Times app for every single day for COVID case counts. And I got to the point where I was just like, this isn't healthy. I'm like training myself to be looking
that actually
for
makes so
negatives.
much sense.
Yeah. So I got to the point where I entirely disengaged with news, and through conversations with friends, family, I realized that a lot of people felt that same way, where it was sort of just like this sense of being overwhelmed by news to the point where you just get to the point where you entirely disengage because there's no alternative. And from my perspective, it's sort of like, why does it have to be that way? I feel like there have to be good news stories out there, or a way to like frame certain stories in a more positive light to a point where we're not just like so overwhelmed that we have to not be aware of as to like anything that's happening in the world. So that's where the idea came about. And I think lots of thoughts in terms of what you said, but I think it can definitely be like, if we're talking about a major news publication or like cable news channel, I think there's a potential for them to have like a good news segment, or like an hour dedicated to positive news where people can engage with news that they deem to be positive, or a section of the website that's focused entirely on good news. I think that's definitely possible. I think part of the reason we launched Nice News is because there wasn't this sort of safe space to engage with news where you know that the content you're going to be reading is uplifting, relevant, uplifting. So that's where we initially came from. But also we realized that there's so many stories out there that were just being overshadowed by other headlines, where news sources were focusing like the greater majority of their coverage on like 2% of, I don't know the exact percentage, but like it felt like very little of what's actually happening in the world. So there was just this need to uncover these stories and then present that in a format that's easy to digest each day. And obviously, having been in the email world, of course, I naturally thought of newsletters as the first place to start.
Yeah, no, so that makes sense. When I was thinking about this last night as I was researching too, I was like, I was like thinking myself into this corner. I was like, well, I guess it's like, because I'm like, how do you have good news without bad news? Because it's like, you know, joy and despair, two sides of the coin of life, right? Like, how do you can't have one without the other. But then I was like, my problem is I'm thinking about this as if it were an island where it's like, you know, you go on Twitter, there might be, there's accounts that just post like nice pictures of dogs, right? And it's like, that's all they post, nice pictures of dogs. But it's like they exist within Twitter. So there's all this other stuff. So it's just like one thing. So I was like, yeah, I was grappling with this. Like, how does this make sense? But I was like, oh, well, I guess it's like, it's not like this is the only news outlet. It's like people are consuming the other news things too. And then this is like, again, this rest stop where it's like, I want to learn about something that's happened, but give me some good news.
Yeah. That's the goal, is not obviously replace these major news outlets. We're trying to provide a healthy alternative or supplement people's news consumption. So maybe they start their day with New York Times, but then after they read Nice News. And ultimately our mission with Nice News is to help filter people's lives through a more optimistic lens. So I think it's difficult to do that when you start your day and you're reading really negative content and overwhelming content that translates into how you interact in the world. how you personally feel, and then how you interact with others.
So the relationship with other news outlets, do you know much about like how people who read Nice News, like how this sits within their broader media diets, or is it kind of just like what we're already talking about it, where it's like assumptions? But yeah, if you know anything about that, I would love to hear it.
Yeah. I can't remember the exact percentage, but it was the greater majority of people are reading Nice News because it's content that they're not seeing on other news sources. So we've leaned into that in terms of curation and like why we exist. And then also the greater majority of our subscribers are reading other news sources as well. It's not their only source of news, which I think makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, no, absolutely. One other thing about like relationship with other outlets, when I first saw it, I was like, I couldn't tell, like, is this an aggregator or is there original reporting, original writing? And now my impression is that it's a mix of both. But at first I was like, is this an aggregator? Because I'm like, oh, I've heard this story before. Like, I'm on the internet 14 hours a day. Like, so like I've seen this. But then there's something like, oh, this is like, this person is being credited as having told Nice News this quote. So I'm really interested. What's kind of the mix of original reporting versus kind of aggregation and like, recycling stories?